On this week's What the Ship, we examine the container sector. We look at the export of grain from Ukraine through the Black Sea. We look at the Russian oil cap. The U.S. has decided to sanction some Chinese illegal fishing. And there is another attack against the Jones Act. Hi, I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano, and welcome to this week's What the Ship. So obviously a lot going on. We've been covering this now for 62 episodes. Amazing how far we've gone with this show. And we'll keep going as long as we have your support. So if you're new to the channel, hey, take a second and subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's go ahead and jump into story number one. Story number one comes from the Wall Street Journal. It'll be the first of two stories we look at this week from the Wall Street Journal. The mainstream media has been doing more and more looking at commercial shipping, which is great. Something they should have been doing for a long time. Understand, for most of the history of major journalism, there were dock reporters, there were maritime reporters, almost all the major news outlets had someone who did this. Now they tend not to, and instead this is a secondary, tertiary, whatever is below tertiary level for them to look at. But since the supply chain crisis, they have taken more and more of a look at it. This report right here really highlights something that we've been talking about on this channel for a long time. That is the situation on the west coast of the United States. The headline, California long ruled U.S. shipping, importers are drifting east. I disagree with the term drifting. They are sailing past the ports of LA and Long Beach, heading to the east coast. And there is a myriad of issues that all contributed to this. Understand, LA and Long Beach historically had been the big receiving port for cargo across the Pacific. About 40% of all cargo for the U.S. container-wise come in through LA and Long Beach. However, 2/3 of that cargo gets transferred to rail and then shipped eastward. Only 1/3 of the cargo really remains in the southwest part of the United States. So for ease of shipment, it had always been into LA and Long Beach. But with the opening of this new lane of the Suez Canal in 2016, the creation of these Neo-Panamax vessels, the use of ultra-large container vessels that sail westward from Asia to transshipment points in the Middle East and Europe, now LA and Long Beach are facing difficulties. Add to it a lot of their own doing. AB5, which went against independent truck drivers. Emission laws that are going to remove a batch of drayage trucks from the pool that can move cargo. The threatening of hyperdemurrage when LA and Long Beach had allowed for years cargo to sit on their terminals. And really the inefficiency of some of the ports there, or some of the terminals in LA and Long Beach, are just driving everyone to other areas. Yes, it is bargain basement prices right now to ship to LA and Long Beach. However, the issue here is reliability. Well, let's look at some stories that break this down for us. So first, this story from Mike Schuller over at G-Captain. Fitch, container shipping outlook deteriorates as freight rates fall. So Fitch, who does these reports on container shipping, basically came out with a new report that, surprisingly says that the shipping outlook is not good, that we're seeing the decline in freight. However, I always say you got to be really careful in how you look at this, in what the comparison is. So just talking about LA and Long Beach, ships sailing past them. They're still the biggest ports in the United States combined. I mean, there's no doubt about that. They're not going to shutter up and cargo stop coming to them. Let's be clear about it. They're going to be major ports. Yes, New York, New Jersey is now the single largest port, larger than LA or Long Beach. But when you put the mega complex together, LA Long Beach is the biggest still. Winter lull for U.S. ports as container imports continue to wind down. Mike looked at the National Retail Federation's reports and a couple of good stats right here. So here are the monthly retail imports for 2021, 2022. One of the things you see here when you look at this chart is early part of 2022, imports were up over the previous year. If you look at the second half, they're down. But when you look at the totals, they're amazingly similar. I mean, exactly similar. We're looking at 25.8 million TEUs estimated for 2022. We were at 25.8 million TEUs the previous year. And notice this big, huge, massive jump. The question is, where do we go in 2023? Do we stay stable with this? Do we drop a little bit? And even if we drop, we were up on an upward tick. This is a big kind of bubble right here in the middle, we jumped quite a bit. The question is, where on 2023 do we find ourselves on the backside? We're not crashing down. Let's be clear about that. The most we're going to do is fall down to 2020 levels. But we are not seeing a crash across the board. It is so many factors at play, and I failed even to mention the biggest one, which is the ILWU PMA labor renegotiation that's going on. Just saw Gene Soroka on all the news watches. He was on Squawk Box on CNBC, and he thinks that they're going to have a negotiation settlement by March or February. Understand, that's 7-8 months since this started. When you have 7-8 months of uncertainty, it means you're jeopardizing business, and that's exactly what's happened. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to story number 2. Story number 2 takes us to the Black Sea and Ukrainian grain exports. So just did a great story on the Mississippi River rising back up and reopening of a lot of barge traffic on the Mississippi, which is great. Soybeans, corn, and eventually winter wheat will be able to come down now and feed the world and provide necessary food out there. Ukraine has been providing this through the Black Sea Grain Initiative brokered by the UN and Turkey between Ukraine and Russia. However, one of the things we've been seeing here are these targeted strikes by the Russians against Ukrainian infrastructure, in particularly power. And power is really key because without power, you're not moving grain. You cannot move the grain out of the silos, out of the holding facilities, and into ships. And one of the things we're seeing here is an attack on the port of Ukraine, shut it down on Sunday. And now what we're seeing here is these type of attacks are slowing down the ability of the ports. One of the other ports here, Chornomorsk, I know I said that wrong, I apologize, is now operating at about 80% capacity. More than 1.5 million people in the southern Odessa region were without power after Russian drone strikes hit 2 energy facilities. And what this means is without power, you're not going to be able to get that goods out. And without those ports running, then you're not exporting goods. So what we've been seeing so far is the 3 ports that are being used for this have about a combined capacity to ship about 3 million tons of grain a month. And they want to expand this. They want to start bringing in another port into this because of the pushback of Russian forces into the city of out of the city of Kherson. But again, if power is out in these areas and this targeted offensive by the Russians against Ukrainian power knocks out these ports, that is critical. But again, we're ramping up the war. We're seeing that. We're seeing attacks on the port infrastructures. Ukraine did this with their kamikaze kayaks that hit the port of Sevastopol and then later on further in the Black Sea. And again, escalation of this war always has the potential to drag in neutral powers and expand to hit commercial shipping, which is the big danger in my opinion. All right, let's jump over to story number 3. Story number 3 keeps us in the Black Sea, but we're talking about Russian oil. And actually, it's not just the Black Sea, it's the Baltic, it's the Pacific, it's the Arctic. It is Russian export of oil. This story right here I thought was really interesting. It's a Bloomberg story. I'm going to, again, all these are going to be in the show notes so you can pull them up. But it's a nice FAQ on what's going on with it. And I thought it was a real quick summary to where we're standing right now with this. So who is sanctioning what? Which is a really big question. Everyone is talking about, what's being sanctioned here. And what we're seeing right now is we're seeing that the European Union is banning the import of crude oil produced in Russia by sea. There is an exemption here for some countries. Bulgaria, for example, can because it ships it by pipeline into the interior, because overland shipment of oil by Russia is not sanctioned. That doesn't kick in until February. And so we're seeing that. Go on here. How will the world global cap work? Well, crude oil that is traded at or below $60, then it's not affected. This is under the G7 and the European Union. Fortunately for Russia, Russian oil is way below $60. So this cap is really not impacting anything at all. So everything is flowing the way it should be done. The key enforcement mechanism here is insurance, namely the big 13 P&I clubs that belong to the international group of P&I clubs. However, there are other P&I clubs out there. For example, Russia has its own underwriter that can underwrite the insurance, but not everyone recognizes that insurance company. But again, it's not an issue because as long as you're below $60 per barrel on Ural oil, which it is right now, then this price cap doesn't kick in. Russian response, it's been fairly interesting. Russia has consistently said it won't sell oil to countries that participate in the price cap. Well, no one's really participating in the price cap because the oil is well below it. Foreign Minister Lavrov said Thursday that Russia will continue to negotiate with its partners directly over the pricing of crude sales, knowing that there's always an element of balance of interest. Goes down here. A host of countries continue to import oil from Russia along the pipeline, Europe's largest, while up to 1.5 million barrels a day of oil from Kazakhstan is shipped from a terminal close to Russia's Novorossiysk port that are not banned. And then who is doing the shipping? Well, that's an interesting group. I'm going to show you here in a minute. Great story by Sam Chambers over at Splash 24/7. Takes a look at that. What has been exempted? And again, the exemption here is oil that comes out of Russia, but it is not Russian oil. This would be Kazakhstan oil and oil going to different areas that are not basically within the sanction package. So for example, Bulgaria has an exemption for that. There are some other exemptions that are out there. And then finally, that last story I was talking about, this is that Sam Chambers story. The rise of the dark fleet risks global shipping reputation. One of the things that's really been interesting is the enhanced reputation of global shipping, particularly in the tanker sector. If you looked at tankers in the 60s, 70s, 80s, holy crud, they were terrible. This is the period of the really bad tankers, horrendous accidents. I mean, you still have tanker accidents, don't get me wrong, but nowhere near the scope and scale and size that you were seeing, or frequency you were seeing back then. There was a lot done to improve the tanker sector. However, this is rising the risk because why? Because what you're seeing is of the over 2,000 tankers out there, many of them are being associated in this high risk category for having to do operations below the radar. One of the things that Sam Chambers included here is this ship-to-ship operation chart. Shows you the number of ship-to-ship operations where oil is transferred to another ship in this kind of skin-to-skin transfer. Now, these vessels do this typically at anchor in protected harbors and anchorages, and you're either consolidating or taking the fuel from larger tankers and dispersing it into smaller tankers. This is done fairly typically around the world. However, what we're seeing is a proliferation of this, and more importantly, it's not being done in protected anchorages. It's being done in the open ocean, open seas, without any sort of really concern or protection for the environment. And what you're potentially seeing is as this increases, and you see that huge spike all of a sudden kick up in April, and you can see the number of operations that have kicked up, that means that we could potentially see more and more problems. So for example, where in the South Atlantic, you barely saw this happen at all. You've seen this massive uptick in the South Atlantic where it's taking place. All of this has the potential for concern for the world because as you're doing these ship-to-ship tankers transfers, these are not underway replenishments. They're not sailing alongside each other at speed, pumping fuel by a hose. They're moored against each other, bumping up against each other. They'll throw fenders out between them, but there's always the danger of a spill here. And that is a concern for everyone around the planet. All right, let's go ahead and jump to our next story. Story 4 is an area I don't hit anywhere near enough, and I really need to do it, is the idea or the concept of illegal fishing, which is out there. The U.S. sanctions people and entities over China-based illegal fishing. The United States on Friday imposed sanctions on people and companies, including NASDAQ-listed Pingtan Marine Enterprises, over what Washington says are human rights abuses linked to Chinese-based illegal distant water fishing. It goes on here, the Treasury Department imposed sanctions on 10 other entities around the world. It also targeted 157 Chinese flag fishing vessels linked to these entities. It goes on here, the Treasury condemns the practices of those sanctions today, which involve the abuse of human rights, undermine fundamental labor and environmental standards, and harm the economic prospects of local populations in the Indo-Pacific. So illegal fishing is a major, major problem. And particularly on these fleets where these personnel are put on here and basically sold into slavery. They can't get off. Understand what the Chinese do, and other countries do this, is they send these fishing fleets out around the world. Here's marine traffic with an examination of world fishing vessels. These are all the world fishing vessels as they're squawking. I'm going to come over here to the coast of South America and zoom in here for a minute to show you what this means. So this is off the coast here of Peru and Chile, and you'll see these vessels all clustered in right here. This is just outside the 200-mile exclusion zone of these countries. And these fishing vessels will harvest fish from these areas because outside the EEZs, it's open fishing there except international laws, but who enforces them? They will sit outside these EEZs and basically farm and fish these things to death. And that's what they do. These fishing fleets move around the world. And if you look around here, you'll see them all over the place, particularly in the South Pacific right now, where you're seeing a lot of them out here. And then the other place you see them in huge numbers is over here in the Indian Ocean. Notice this big, huge circle around the Maldives where fishing fleets are at. One of the things the United States, with the Coast Guard, the Navy, and other nations have done is help a lot of nations enforce their EEZs. Why'd you get piracy off the coast of Somalia in the early 2010s? It's because illegal fishing depleted all the fishing stock. Why no one's fishing off there now? Depleted all the fishing stocks off there, and the fishermen turned to piracy. And now you have the U.S. targeting these companies and these entities for basically human trafficking and human slavery. They'll put people on these boats. These fishing boats don't return for months, in some cases years at a time, because they will fish, and then dump their load into these processing and supply boats while they can stay out there and fish and fish and fish. And it is a abhorrent practice that's being done. We need to be much more proactive. Understand, beyond 200 miles out is the lawless sea. There is very little regulation and control out there. And one of the things we are seeing the U.S. does and other nations do is use their coast guards, use their militaries, whoever does maritime enforcement, going out there and helping countries that don't have the ability to do it. I showed you the AIS, but understand there are ships that unplug those, and those vessels run inside the 200-mile zone, fish, and then come back out. And then they dump it. And unless you have satellite oversight, unless you have enforcement with vessels in the area, Ecuador had this with the Chinese pushing in on the Galapagos Islands. You'll see this happen all the time, and you have to be more concerned about depleting the overall stock of the world's fisheries. All right, let's go to our last story for the day. So last story for the day comes from Costa Paris over at the Wall Street Journal, and I'm going to use their tweet they did on this, which has kind of a synopsis here through pictures by Dave Cole. So, how the century-old Jones Act affects today's home heating prices. The maritime law aimed to prop up U.S. industry after World War I, but its limitations result in higher prices for shipments, including home heating oil and natural gas, critics say. So, first off, prop up. No, that's not what it was done. Now, understand, there's criticisms against the Jones Act, and for those of you who don't know, this is the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, specifically Section 27, which says that to move cargo from one U.S. port to another U.S. port, a ship has to be U.S. flagged, U.S. owned, U.S. built, and U.S. crewed. That's the law that's been in place. And understand, this comes directly out of World War I. Why? Because at the beginning of World War I, 1914, the U.S. found itself with its international shipping absolutely humbled because the British abandoned U.S. shipping, moving U.S. cargo to prioritize in the war. The Germans had to flee the high seas, and goods piled up on U.S. docks, and the U.S. went into an economic recession in 1914. Fortunately, it had a large, robust, coastwise fleet to pick up this trade. And what the U.S. did after World War I was codify it into the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. And there's a whole batch of provisions in the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. It's not just that. It provides for international shipping, control of rates, shipbuilding, federal oversight in certain areas, labor provisions. It's a massive bill. And I have a whole video that talks about that I'll include here for you. However, the target here has to do with home heating oil and prices up in the New England area. So let's just roll through the Wall Street Journal here. So first off, they talk about prices of oil and gas used to heat homes in the Northeast are at the highest levels in years, and state governors have asked the federal government for help. The request included suspending the Jones Act so that natural gas could be delivered by tanker from places like Texas to Massachusetts. So Texas to Massachusetts, number one, the problem with that is it's really expensive to ship natural gas by ship up to New England. Now, you can ask yourself a very simple question. Like, wait a minute, Sal, why is there not a natural gas pipeline from the Midwest part of the country where we have all this natural gas? Why are we not piping it up into New England? Because a pipeline would be the cheapest way because you don't have to liquefy it. In other words, you don't have to supercool it. You don't have to put it on a ship, which costs about $500,000 a day in charter rate, and then bring it up to New England and then have to regasify it and distribute it. Pipeline sounds the best. Well, that's because New York won't allow a pipeline to cross it. And even though I was born and raised in New York, I got to say New York is being a bit of a tool about this. I'm not sure why. Again, my supposition is it has to do with the Patriots and the Red Sox. That's exactly what I think it is. But in my opinion, this is impeding federal interstate commerce, which is a federal jurisdiction. And I'm not sure why the federal government hasn't intervened in this. Suffice it to say that one liquefied natural gas tanker would handle all the needs of liquefied natural gas for New England. Now, I also have a question about why is it that New England doesn't have more storage capacity for natural gas, which would make sense to me. Instead of running out in the wintertime, why not build up your natural storage points for it? But, you know, that's me thinking about reasonable things, not being a politician who wants to make an issue every winter. Tankers which carry liquefied natural gas or oil products aren't typically American-made, in part because of the high cost to build them domestically. Okay, that is true. It is more expensive to build in the U.S. That is because Japan, China, and Korea, which build 94% of the world's shipping, if you go to Okinawa and put a 1,000-mile circle around there, literally 95%, if you throw the Philippines in, are within that circle. And the reason is they subsidize the crap out of their building. That's why. They get huge government incentives to do this. And they incentivize everything out of it. The problem is the U.S. got out of that in the 1980s. And so what happens is it gets more expensive to build ships. And the less ships you build, the more expensive they become. Hey, go buy an F-150 from a dealership and then go build one yourself. And tell me which one is more expensive overall. And I'm going to tell you, the one you build yourself is going to be it. When you build only 1 or 2 ships a year, those are works of art. Those aren't ships. Going on here, only 99 ocean-going vessels qualify for the U.S. deliveries between states, according to the Department of Transportation. There are more than 60,000 ocean-going commercial ships in the world globally. Well, okay. 60,000 more than 1,000 gross tons. All right, well, then in that case, you're not counting U.S. flagged offshore supply vessels. You're not counting ferries. Again, you got to be careful about these numbers that they like to use. That's not exactly an accurate depiction right there. But if you look at cargo ships, yeah, there's only a handful of cargo ships, and this is the smallest the U.S. ocean-going fleet has ever been. We're 21st in the world today, down from number 1 at the end of World War II. By the way, China's number 2. Today. And by the way, China, Japan, Korea, those big shipbuilders, all have large, robust merchant marines, and they also have large, robust navies. This shipbuilding capacity goes hand in hand. So that if we want to be a large, robust naval and commercial entity, we probably need to build on the commercial side. The problem is the Navy hates talking about this. Ships that meet Jones Act requirements can command rates around 10 times higher. Bull. I don't know where he pulled this number out. I'd love to see where he pulled this number out, but I'm calling BS on this right off the bat. This is, again, let's find one commodity and do it. That's absolute crud. They will talk about the Act's annual cost to Hawaii's economy was estimated at $1.2 billion, according to a 2020 study published by the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii. Let me be clear. You repeal the Jones Act tomorrow for Hawaii, Hawaii will see a massive decrease in the cost to ship goods there. Why? Because the Chinese Overseas Shipping Company, the state-run firm of China, will jump at the opportunity to be the company that's the sole source supplier for Hawaii, for good reasons. And by the way, you would still need U.S. flag ships to go to Hawaii because of the military requirement, because the DoD, Department of Defense's footprint is so large in Hawaii, you have to have it come in there. So it makes almost no sense to repeal the Jones Act going to Hawaii. Department of Homeland Security has authority over granting Jones Act waivers. This act can be lifted in cases of emergency, such as national disasters. Can be clear, that is bull for the Department of Homeland Security to have it because they don't understand this. They got this because of CBP, Customs and Border Protection. This really needs to be under Commerce. It really needs to be under Transportation. It really needs to be under DoD. It should be under, the Maritime Administration, which should be the entity that's looking at this to determine whether or not a grant of a waiver should be given. 6 New England governors, including Janet Mills of Maine, sought a Jones Act waiver to tame rising residential energy prices. A waiver will allow foreign ships to deliver U.S.-produced natural gas. Have the solution. Have the video on this. I've talked about this for years. Go ahead and get an LNG tanker, give it a 5-year waiver, but replace the crew with American mariners, put it under U.S. registry, U.S. flag, 5 to 10 years. You put a surcharge on every million cubic meters or feet of LNG that is exported on a foreign flag tanker out of the United States, build up a pot of money to build U.S. LNG carriers, and there you go. You're solved. This is easy to fix, but nobody wants to fix it. Why? Because those who hate the Jones Act just want to repeal so that foreign builders can bring their ships in, the foreign companies can bring their ships in, and then U.S. companies don't want it because they feel like if they take a step off the mountaintop, that this is the end of U.S. shipping, and that's where it stands. U.S. government granted a Jones Act waiver last year for fuel shipments to the East Coast after the Colonial Pipeline, the largest U.S. fuel pipeline, shut down following a cyber attack. And once again, I'm going to use a technical term, bullshit on this one, because this was not needed at all. At all. There was U.S. tankers sitting in docks waiting to load. But again, people caused hysteria because of the concept that we were running out of fuel. Where we were running out of fuel because of the Colonial Pipeline was at airports. Our airports have a limited amount of fuel capacity to hold jet fuel because of the way it breaks down. However, residential fuel, gasoline, diesel, that was fine. There were tank loads of this stuff pre-positioned along the pipeline. It was fine. And when they grant a waiver like that, what they do is they expose the security weakness of the United States. The fact that we did not have U.S. Jones Act tankers on standby that could load jet fuel and top off airports up and down the East Coast. And when I say airports, I'm not just talking about commercial airports. I'm also talking about military bases. That is a key national security issue. Goes on here, after Hurricane Fiona caused widespread damage around Puerto Rico in September, U.S. officials waived the Jones Act to be able to supply the territory with shipments of diesel fuel. Again, technical term, bullshit. This was an oil company, loaded a tanker, knew it was in violation of the Jones Act, put it off the coast, and then got media all spun up about this, that people were running out of diesel fuel, when I had my buddy who runs diesel fuel on tugs and barges around the island, Tim, tell me that there was plenty of diesel fuel ashore, that this was pure just chaos being raised by them. But again, that's what they love to do. Go on here. Hawaii requested a waiver in May for fuel supplies as 1/3 of its oil came from Russia before the invasion of Ukraine. The request wasn't granted. Again, this has to do with the fact that the U.S. has not built a refinery since 1977, and we need a certain type of oil to refine. That is a big, huge, massive problem. The Jones Act has bipartisan support, including from President Biden. Recent measures introduced in Congress to overhaul the law have failed. Again, because it's not to overhaul the law, it's to repeal the law. That's what they keep coming in with. And what needs to happen is reform. This bill desperately needs reforming, and it should be reformed. But the problem is one side wants it repealed, the other one wants it carved in stone. On here, domestic shipbuilding has recently received a boost. Philly Shipyard in November received a $1 billion contract to build 3 box ships for Matson Navigation, which caused those who opposed the Jones Act to go up in arms because they compared these ships to foreign-built ships and said, you know, these ships are way overpriced and much smaller in capacity. Well, it doesn't matter the size of a vessel in many ways, to tell you the truth, because once you build a vessel, you got to put an engine, you got to get the hull. It's all a matter of just, you know, more feet, length, and width. It's about the same no matter what. But yeah, these 3 ships are expensive because we're not building enough ships. We need to be building ships. Yet the people who tell you to stop building ships will then scream when we do build a few ships because they're expensive. Until you start building ships more frequently, more regularly, they're going to be expensive. And oh, by the way, this causes U.S. Navy ships to be more expensive also. What we're seeing here is this issue that comes up every winter. I mean, it's every winter. I'm not kidding. It's like when the leaves fall, we're going to have an issue on the Jones Act. Why is it we don't have a summit with all the principal people together, called by the Maritime Administration, called by I don't know who, but call them together and let's hash out a proposal from 6 states in New England to fix this? It's how many times are we going to go through this until we get a solution? Instead, what we do is we wait for it to hit the wall, and then all of a sudden we got to scramble. And that's not the way to do policy. I'm sorry. It's just not. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, give it a thumbs up, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? Very simply. You can hit that super thanks button below, in which you can contribute directly to the page, or head on over to Patreon and become a patron of the page. I have a monthly and yearly subscription rate you can do, and that allows me to keep this page up and running. Until our next video, this is Sal, signing off.